The winter of 1944 pressed its weight upon the Ardennes like an iron hand. The forests stood silent, their branches heavy with snow, their stillness broken only by the distant rumbles of artillery or the groaning of trucks along frozen roads. For the German soldiers dug in on the far side of the line, the quiet was deceptive, an interlude between storms. They had watched the Americans struggle with the snow, fumbling with their heavy equipment, faces pinched by cold. Laughter had bubbled among the Wehrmacht ranks. They thought the Green Americans were clumsy, unprepared, incapable of withstanding what was to come. That laughter echoed in the memory of Private Jack Connolly as he adjusted the strap of his rifle and pushed through the waist-deep snow. His boots were soaked, and every step felt like he was dragging weights behind him. Around him trudged the rest of the platoon, bundled in layers that did little to ward off the bitter wind. Ahead, their commander's voice barked orders, crisp and sharp, refusing to let fatigue settle into their bones. They were Patton's men now, part of the Third Army that had been thrown into the teeth of winter, tasked with turning the tide of a war that had grown darker by the week. Patton's reputation marched with them like a ghost, his fiery speeches, his uncompromising demand for speed and aggression. Rumors spread faster than the cold through the ranks, that Patton had prayed for weather to break, that he drove his men as if the enemy's laughter were personal insults aimed at him. Connolly wasn't sure what to believe. He only knew that every man in his unit was stretched to the edge of endurance, and still, they moved forward, because stopping was not an option. The first contact came at dawn. The Americans crested a ridge where the trees parted, revealing a white field scarred with trenches. A thin fog drifted over it, ghost-like in the early light. At first, all was silent. The kind of silence that carried weight. The kind that made men grip their rifles tighter and listen to the hammering of their own hearts. Then, without warning, the sharp crack of rifles split the morning. Snow erupted at their feet, bullets slicing through the powder with lethal whispers. Men shouted, diving for cover. The forest swallowed their cries as the Germans opened fire, with grim precision. Pinned against the tree line, Connolly pressed his face into the snow, its icy bite searing against his skin. He could hear laughter again, this time carried over from the enemy trenches. The Germans mocked them openly, voices rising above the gunfire, jeers in a language he could not understand, but whose meaning was unmistakable. Rage rose in him like fire cutting through the cold. His sergeant shouted, rallying them to return fire. The crack of American rifles answered, and soon the air was filled with the chaotic symphony of war. Hours dragged on, measured not by clocks, but by volleys of fire and the screams of the wounded. The snow became a canvas for violence, each patch stained darker as men fell. Still the Germans jeered, convinced the Americans were too raw, too soft to press forward. But behind every shot fired from the American side lay the weight of Patton's demand, no hesitation, no retreat. Their commander's voice haunted them even in his absence, compelling them to move. When the order to advance finally came, it felt less like strategy and more like desperation. Connolly scrambled forward with the others, heart pounding, every sense sharpened to the point of pain. Machine guns rattled from the trenches ahead, spitting fire into the advancing line. Men fell beside him, cries cut short, their bodies twisting into the snow. Connolly's world narrowed to the rhythm of his breath, the recoil of his rifle, the pounding of boots over frozen ground. And then, miraculously, they reached the first trench. Grenades tumbled in, exploding with violent finality. The laughter that had haunted them fell silent, replaced by shouts of fear and pain. Connolly leapt down, bayonet ready, and came face to face with a young German soldier whose eyes were wide with terror. In that frozen second, both men stared, seeing themselves mirrored in the other, cold, exhausted, human. But the war allowed no pause. The clash was swift, brutal, and when it ended, the snow drank deep again. By nightfall, the Americans held the field. Fires burned low, casting long shadows across the churned-up snow. The silence had returned, but it was no longer mocking. It was heavy, suffocating, a silence filled with ghosts. Connolly sat with his back against a shattered tree, his rifle, across his knees, staring at the stars that glittered indifferently above. The laughter of the morning seemed like a memory from another world, distant and unreal. All that remained was exhaustion and the knowledge that tomorrow would demand even more of them. The Ardennes held many such days, each one chipping away at the souls of the men who fought there. Yet in their endurance, in their refusal to yield, lay the seeds of a grim transformation. The Germans would not laugh forever. The snow would not stay white. The march did not end with the capture of the first trench. For Patton's soldiers, victory was measured not in a single battlefield, but in the relentless grind forward, step by step, through forests and villages buried beneath snow. The Ardennes seemed endless, a maze of white and shadow where every tree might conceal an enemy and every silence threatened an ambush. Their breath froze in clouds before their faces, boots cracked against the frozen earth, and yet they pressed on, driven less by orders than by the knowledge that stopping meant death. By late December, the snow had deepened, transforming roads into traps and trails into rivers of ice. Supply trucks lagged behind and rations grew thin. Hungry men fought with an edge of desperation, the gnawing in their stomachs sharpening their tempers. Cigarettes were traded like gold, and letters from home became talismans folded into breast pockets, pressed against beating hearts as if the words themselves could shield them from bullets. Connolly carried one from his sister, its paper worn, soft from his constant handling. He read the same lines again and again at night, though the ink had nearly faded in the damp cold. The Germans, too, struggled under the same winter's fist, but they knew the land better, and they mocked the Americans whenever they could. Connolly remembered one encounter as the platoon advanced through a narrow valley. German voices carried over the ridgeline, calling insults in broken English. "Go home, boys, too cold for Yankees." The laughter drifted down like poison. Some of the Americans spat curses back, others tightened their grips on rifles. The mockery was not just words. It was a reminder that the enemy still believed them weak. The fight that followed burned away all traces of that laughter. Machine guns opened from the high ground, cutting across the valley with lethal precision. Snow erupted into geysers as bullets struck, and the platoon scattered for cover. Connolly dropped behind a boulder, his heart hammering in his chest, while tracers carved fiery arcs through the twilight. The order to climb came, shouted over the chaos, and the men moved as if pulled by an unseen hand. The ascent was brutal. Ice slicked the rocks and men slipped, clawing with frozen fingers for holds. The Germans fired down with rifles and grenades, determined to hold the ridge. Each foot gained was paid for with blood. Connolly scrambled upward, boots slipping, lungs burning, until he pulled himself over the lip of the ridge. There, in the choking smoke and stinging snow, the battle turned savage and close. Rifles cracked at near point-blank range. Bayonets flashed. Men grappled, boots slipping on the frozen earth, each breath clouded with exertion and fear. When the ridge finally fell silent, the snow was stained dark in uneven patches, the drifts broken by bodies lying still. Connolly stood with his rifle slack at his side, staring at the ruin. He had no strength left for triumph. Around him, men slumped against rocks, gasping, eyes hollow. No one spoke. The fire of battle had burned away into a silence so deep that only the wind remained. Night brought no peace. Temperatures plummeted, and fires were forbidden for fear of drawing enemy artillery. The men huddled together in their coats, shivering so violently that their teeth rattled. Sleep came in fits, broken by sudden jolts of gunfire or the moans of the wounded. In the morning, frost rimed their eyelashes and clung to their rifles. Connolly awoke to find one of his comrades stiff and still beside him, frozen during the night. He could not even recall the man's last words. Through all of it, the figure of Patton loomed over them like a specter. Rumors traveled quickly of the general driving along icy roads in his command car, urging units to move faster, harder, further. Some cursed his name in whispered tones, blaming him for pushing them beyond human endurance. Others clung to his reputation as a kind of anchor, proof that someone, somewhere, believed they could achieve the impossible. For Connolly, Patton was both phantom and firebrand, absent in body, but present in every command, every push forward. The advance carried them into villages half buried in snow, their stone houses shattered by shells, their streets eerily empty. In some, they found civilians who greeted them with desperate relief. In others, only silence and shadows remained. One village, remembered forever in Connolly's mind, lay strewn with abandoned belongings, children's toys, dishes still on tables, yet no living soul appeared. The snow outside was pocked with boot prints leading away. War had hollowed it out, leaving only ghosts. It was there that the Germans struck again. Mortar fire rained down suddenly, exploding in the narrow lanes, tearing walls apart and sending men scrambling for cover. The battle turned house to house, room to room, each doorway contested with savage determination. Smoke and dust mixed with the falling snow until the air itself felt like suffocation. Connolly burst through a doorway and came face to face with a German soldier not much older than himself. They both fired at once. The German fell, eyes wide, while Connolly stumbled back, ears ringing, rifle hot in his hands. Hours later, when the village was secured, the Americans found themselves surrounded not by victory but by wreckage. The air smelled of smoke and blood. Snow drifted through holes in shattered roofs, settling on corpses as if to cover them in a blanket of white. Some men laughed bitterly at the irony. The snow, once a symbol of purity, had become their grave's companion. As darkness fell, Connolly sat on a broken wall, staring at the horizon. He remembered the jeers from the ridgeline, the mocking voices. They were silent now. The laughter had been burned away, smothered beneath the fire and the snow. Yet in that silence lay no comfort, only the weight of knowing how much more they would endure before the end. The war pressed on, grinding them forward like stones in a river, each battle shaping them, hardening them, even as it stripped pieces of their humanity away. And somewhere ahead, beyond the next ridge, beyond the next ruined village, lay the moment when the Germans would finally understand. Their laughter had birthed something relentless, something they could not stop. January crept over the Ardennes with no mercy. The snow was deeper now, its weight pressing down upon the forest, muffling sound and slowing every movement. What had once been crisp white drifts were now stained with soot and ash, churned by boots, tank treads, and blood. The men of Patton's Third Army had grown gaunt, their faces hollowed by hunger and exhaustion, yet their eyes carried something new, a hardness forged in the crucible of endless fighting. The Germans had laughed once, but no one laughed anymore. For Connolly, the days blended together in a rhythm of marches and firefights. He had learned to measure time not by hours, but by survival. One frozen dawn, one deafening barrage, one desperate push forward. Each morning began with the same ritual, checking his rifle, rubbing warmth into his numb fingers, whispering a silent plea that today would not be his last. Each night ended with bodies huddled together against the cold, sharing what little heat they could, while the dead were carried aside to stiffen in the snow. The turning point began with rumors. Word spread that the Germans' great offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, as it was already being called, was faltering. Supplies were dwindling on their side as well, fuel tanks running dry, soldiers starving. The once confident enemy, who had mocked the Americans so brazenly in December, was now stretched thin, clinging to ground they could no longer hold. Patton's men sensed it in the air. The tide was shifting. But victory, they learned, was not a gift. It was clawed from the frozen earth with bloodied hands. The push through the Ardennes demanded everything. Tanks ground forward along icy roads, their treads slipping, engines groaning. Artillery thundered day and night, shaking the very bones of the men who followed behind. The sky cleared just enough for Allied planes to return, their bombs tearing German positions apart. But even that brought no comfort to the infantry who still had to advance into the wreckage. Connolly's platoon was tasked with taking a crossroads, near Bastogne, a strategic junction the Germans had fortified heavily. The approach was a nightmare. Open ground, waist-deep snow, and machine guns waiting in the tree line. They moved at night, the moon casting a pale light over the frozen fields. The silence was suffocating. Every crunch of a boot, every rattle of equipment felt like a beacon to the enemy. When the first flare burst above, Washing the snow in a ghostly glow, the world erupted in fire. Machine guns hammered, their tracers streaking red across the night. Mortars crashed into the fields, sending up fountains of snow and dirt. Men screamed, dove, scrambled forward. Connolly felt himself propelled less by will than by momentum, his body reacting before his mind could think. Bullets tore the air around him, some close enough to whistle past his ears. He fell into a shell crater, gasping, clutching his rifle like a lifeline. The order to press forward came again, shouted through the chaos. There was no choice. They advanced in short bursts, diving from one shallow depression to the next until, finally, they reached the tree line. Then came the real battle, close quarters, savage, unforgiving. Grenades burst in flashes of orange, rifles cracked in rapid succession, and bayonets gleamed in the firelight. The snow became a battleground, of shadows and screams, the neat white blanket shredded into chaos. When dawn came, the crossroads belonged to the Americans. Smoke curled into the pale sky, carrying with it the acrid stench of cordite and charred wood. The enemy had fallen back, leaving behind broken guns and bodies half buried in snow. Connolly stood at the edge of the road, his legs trembling, his face streaked with grime. He could scarcely believe they were still alive. Around him, his comrades staggered like men in a daze, too tired to speak, too numb to celebrate. They had taken the ground, but the cost was carved into every hollow face and every pair of eyes that stared blankly into the distance. The Germans, once so bold in their laughter, were retreating now, their jokes silenced by the ferocity of men who had endured too much to yield. Reports filtered back. The enemy was pulling away from Bastogne, their armored spearhead broken. The tide had turned, slowly but unmistakably. The Third Army was no longer the butt of mockery. It was the hammer that would drive the enemy back. Still, the war had not ended. Patton's men pressed on step by step, through villages reduced to rubble, through forests splintered by artillery, across fields where the snow covered more dead than living. Connolly felt himself changing with each march, each battle. He no longer flinched at the sound of gunfire, no longer hesitated at the sight of blood. Fear had not vanished, but it had been buried beneath layers of grim determination. He was no longer the boy who had trembled in the snow at the first laughter of the enemy. He was something harder now, something forged in ice and fire. One night, after securing another village, Connolly sat beside a smoldering fire with his platoon. The flames flickered low, casting shadows across their weary faces. Someone muttered about home, about how far away it felt. Another cursed the snow, spitting into the drift at his feet. For a long while, no one spoke. Then quietly, one soldier said, "They don't laugh anymore." The words hung in the air like a benediction. Connolly said nothing, but he felt their truth settle in his chest. The laughter that had once haunted them was gone, replaced by silence, and silence in war was its own kind of victory. Yet even as he closed his eyes, he knew the worst was not behind them. The snow was not finished, drinking its fill. The final reckoning still lay ahead, waiting for them in the blood-red drifts of battles yet to come. By February, the Ardennes looked less like a forest and more like the graveyard of an army. Trees were shattered into splinters, villages reduced to skeletal ruins, and the snow that once glistened pure beneath the winter sun was now churned into a canvas of filth and blood. What had begun as the Germans' gamble to break the Allied lines had twisted into their undoing. They had wanted to laugh at the Americans, to crush them quickly, but Patton's relentless advance had transformed mockery into fear. Connolly trudged along a ruined road with what remained of his platoon. Their numbers had dwindled, familiar faces were gone, replaced by the silence of empty spaces in the marching line. The men who remained carried themselves differently now. Their shoulders were stooped not from weakness, but from the weight of memory, of comrades buried hastily beneath snowdrifts, of battles that had carved scars too deep to heal. They spoke little, for words felt fragile in the shadow of what they had endured. The orders were clear: pursue the retreating Germans, drive them from the Ardennes, leave no ground to be retaken. But clarity on paper was chaos in the field. The eye, Enemy, though weakened, still fought like wolves cornered, striking with ambushes and sudden artillery barrages before vanishing into the forest. Each step forward was bought with vigilance, every night haunted by the possibility of an attack. In the dark, Connolly slept with his rifle cradled in his arms, waking at the smallest sound, his dreams torn apart by gunfire and frozen screams. The worst came outside a small hamlet perched on the edge of a ridge. Snow fell thick that day, heavy flakes, that blurred the world into shifting gray. The platoon advanced cautiously, boots crunching, rifles ready. The village appeared deserted, its stone houses leaning against one another like weary old men. For a moment, it felt like the war had passed it by. Then the first shot rang out. A machine gun opened from a concealed position, tearing through the lead squad. Men dropped into the snow, their cries sharp against the wind. Connolly dove behind a crumbling wall, the impact jarring through his bones. Gunfire echoed off the stone, the village erupting into a storm of sound and fury. Grenades exploded in narrow alleys, showers of stone and blood scattering alike. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughterhouse. The Americans pressed forward, house to house, each room contested with feral desperation. German soldiers fought with the madness of men who knew they were losing, their laughter now replaced by snarls and curses. Connolly burst into a doorway and found himself grappling hand-to-hand with an enemy soldier. The struggle was brutal, primal, ending with Connolly's bayonet finding its mark. He staggered back, chest heaving, staring at the crimson stain spreading across the snow at his feet. By nightfall, the hamlet was theirs, but at a cost that hollowed out the survivors. Fires burned in the ruined houses, their glow casting long, jagged shadows across the ground. The snow was no longer white. It was painted red, streaked where bodies had fallen, soaked where the earth had opened to drink its fill. Connolly stood, amid the wreckage, his rifle heavy in his hands, and realized that the laughter that had once seemed so unbearable was gone forever. What replaced it was worse. Silence thick with ghosts, a silence that clung to him even as the wind howled. When news came that the German offensive had been broken, the men received it not with cheers but with weary nods. Victory felt abstract, distant. They had not fought for headlines or for history. They had fought for the man beside them, for the chance to see another dawn. And though they had turned the tide, though the enemy now fled before them, they knew that nothing could restore what the Ardennes had taken. On the final night before they marched out of the forest, Connolly sat apart from the others, staring at the snow. The moonlight revealed its uneven surface, patches of white, streaks of blackened soot, pools of frozen red. He thought of the Germans' laughter that had once carried across the battlefield, mocking and cruel. He thought of how that laughter had faded, smothered beneath the fury and endurance of men who refused to break. And he thought of how, even in silence, the snow remembered everything. As dawn broke, the platoon gathered their gear and began the long march forward. Their boots crunched over the ground, leaving tracks across the scarred white. Behind them, the Ardennes lay quiet at last, its red shadows already fading into memory, though never truly gone. The laughter was silenced, but its echo remained. A reminder of what had been endured and of what it had cost. For the world would remember the Ardennes as the place where the German offensive had been shattered, where Patton's men had turned the snow red. But for Connolly, and for the survivors who marched beside him, it would always be more personal. It would be the place where innocence was stripped away, where laughter had turned to horror, and where the silence of victory felt as heavy as defeat.